Margaret Wilson had been the invisible engine of her family for 15 years. Every holiday, every celebration, every gathering, she was the one who transformed chaos into perfection, while everyone else simply showed up to enjoy the results. Standing in her pristine kitchen on this December morning, Margaret folded the last of the Thanksgiving tablecloths, the same tablecloths she'd ironed at 5 a.m. 3 weeks ago to accommodate 18 of Jessica's relatives, who descended upon her home like a cheerful tornado. She could still hear Jessica's voice from that morning. "Mom, you're so amazing at this stuff. I could never manage what you do." Amazing. That's what they called it when you worked 16-hour days to make their lives comfortable. Margaret had been 65 when David brought Jessica home 5 years ago. A sweet girl, everyone said. Bubbly and social with an infectious laugh that could light up any room. Margaret had welcomed her with open arms, thrilled that her son had found someone who made him happy. What she hadn't anticipated was how quickly sweet Jessica would transform into someone who viewed Margaret's home as her personal event venue, and Margaret herself as the unpaid staff. It started small. "Oh, Mom, would you mind making that incredible pot roast for my book club? There's only 8 of us." Then it was 12 people for Jessica's birthday, then 15 for her cousin's engagement party. Each time, Jessica would float the idea with that bright smile, always emphasizing how talented Margaret was, how nobody could do it like her. And Margaret, raised in an era where family came first and complaints came never, had said yes every time. The pattern was always the same. Jessica would announce the guest count with the enthusiasm of someone planning a Pinterest party, completely oblivious to the logistics nightmare she was creating. Margaret would spend days beforehand grocery shopping, meal planning, and deep cleaning. The day of the event, she'd be up before dawn, cooking and arranging and setting up while Jessica slept in, then emerged looking gorgeous to play hostess to the guests who had no idea who'd actually made their beautiful day possible. Last Thanksgiving had been the worst yet. 18 people crowded into Margaret's modest dining room, with card tables set up in the living room to accommodate everyone. Margaret had cooked for 3 days straight, 2 turkeys, 5 side dishes, 3 desserts, and enough appetizers to feed a small army. She'd served every course, refilled every glass, and cleared every plate while Jessica entertained her relatives with stories about her new promotion. Margaret remembered standing in the kitchen at 11 p.m. that night, still washing dishes, when Jessica breezed in to grab a glass of wine. "Mom, you outdid yourself again. Everyone was raving about the food. You're like a professional chef or something." A professional chef. Margaret had almost laughed. Professional chefs got paid. "My cousin Linda asked if you cater. I told her you're just naturally gifted." Jessica had taken a sip of wine and leaned against the counter, careful not to get her designer dress wrinkled. "Maybe you should consider it as a side business when you retire." When she retired, as if the unpaid labor she'd been providing for years was just a warm-up for her golden years as Jessica's personal caterer. Easter had been 22 people, Jessica's entire extended family, plus her college roommates who were in town for the weekend. Margaret had spent Good Friday preparing a honey-glazed ham, lamb with rosemary, 3 different potato dishes, and enough vegetables to stock a farmer's market. She decorated the house with fresh flowers, set up an egg hunt for the children, and even made homemade dinner rolls that Jessica's aunt declared restaurant quality. While Margaret served and cleaned and managed the chaos, Jessica had held court on the back patio, regaling everyone with tales of her recent girls' trip to Napa Valley. "We stayed at this incredible resort where they did everything for you," she'd gushed. "It was so relaxing to just be taken care of for once." Taken care of? Margaret had been taking care of Jessica for years, and apparently it was so seamless that Jessica had never even noticed. The breaking point should have come months ago, but Margaret was a product of her generation. You didn't complain, you didn't make waves, you certainly didn't tell your daughter-in-law that you felt like an unpaid servant in your own home. But this morning, as Margaret put away the last remnants of Thanksgiving, she felt something shift inside her chest. A small, quiet rebellion that had been building for months finally found its voice. She was tired, bone deep, soul-weary, tired of being taken for granted. The sound of the front door slamming shook Margaret from her thoughts. Jessica's laugh echoed through the house, followed by David's deeper chuckle. They'd been out shopping for Christmas decorations, another task that would inevitably fall to Margaret to actually implement. "Mom," Jessica's voice called out sweetly, "we're back. Wait until you see what we found for the mantel." Margaret dried her hands on the kitchen towel, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward the living room. David was hanging up their coats while Jessica bounced on her toes with excitement, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "The Christmas shop had the most gorgeous garland," Jessica gushed, pulling items from shopping bags. "And these ornaments will look perfect on your tree. Oh, and I got the most amazing idea while we were out." Margaret felt a familiar knot form in her stomach. Jessica's amazing ideas usually involved Margaret's house, Margaret's kitchen, and Margaret's labor. You know how we always do Christmas so quietly, just the three of us and little Emma? Jessica's eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. "Well, I was thinking this year we should do something really special, really big." David shot his mother a glance that Margaret couldn't quite read. Apologetic? Warning? She couldn't tell. Jessica clasped her hands together like a child about to ask for the biggest gift under the tree. "I want to invite my whole family for Christmas. My parents, my siblings, all the cousins, everyone. It'll be like a real old-fashioned family Christmas." Margaret's mouth went dry. "Your whole family?" "Well, not my great-aunts from Florida, obviously, but everyone else. It's been years since we've all been together for Christmas." Jessica's smile could have powered the entire Christmas light display downtown. "I already called my mom, and she's so excited she started crying." "Jessica," David started carefully, "that's a lot of people." "It's only 25 people." Jessica waved her hand dismissively. "Maybe 26 if my cousin brings her new boyfriend, but what's one more, right?" 25 people in Margaret's house for Christmas. Margaret felt the room tilt slightly. 25 people meant 25 mouths to feed, 25 place settings, 25 overnight accommodations to arrange. It meant cooking for days, cleaning for weeks, and turning her peaceful home into a three-ring circus. "I know it sounds like a lot," Jessica continued, mistaking Margaret's silence for contemplation rather than horror. "But you're so incredible at hosting. Remember Thanksgiving? Everyone's still talking about that meal, and you make it look so effortless." Effortless. Margaret almost choked on the word. "Plus, my family will finally get to see what an amazing cook you are. My sister's been dying to try your famous apple pie ever since I told her about it." Jessica grabbed Margaret's hands, her excitement infectious to everyone except the woman who'd be doing all the work. "What do you think? Isn't it perfect?" Margaret looked at her daughter-in-law's eager face, then at her son, who was studying his shoes with sudden fascination. This beautiful, thoughtless girl had just announced that she was turning Margaret's Christmas into a production worthy of a cruise ship kitchen, and she expected Margaret to be thrilled about the opportunity. 25 people on Christmas in her house. For a moment, Margaret considered saying what she'd always said, "Of course, dear, whatever makes you happy." But as she looked at Jessica's expectant face, something inside Margaret's chest cracked open. 15 years of yes, 15 years of invisible labor, 15 years of being taken for granted in her own home. Margaret smiled. It wasn't her usual accommodating smile, the one that said, "Whatever you need, I'll make it happen." This smile was different, sharper, almost predatory. "Perfect," Margaret said, her voice calm and steady. "I'm going on vacation. You cook and clean. I'm not a servant." The shopping bag slipped from Jessica's hands, Christmas ornaments scattering across the hardwood floor like fallen stars. Her face went pale, then red, then pale again as the words registered. "I'm sorry, what?" Jessica's voice was barely a whisper. "You heard me correctly." Margaret's smile never wavered. 25 people sounds wonderful. You'll have such fun planning the menu, doing the shopping, handling all the cooking and serving and cleaning. I'll be on a cruise ship in the Caribbean, enjoying someone else's cooking for once. David stepped forward, his face a mask of confusion and growing alarm. "Mom, you can't be serious." "I'm completely serious." Margaret turned to face her son, and for the first time in years, she saw him really look at her, not as an extension of the household furniture, but as a person with her own wants and needs. "I've been the unpaid staff for this family for 15 years. I'm retiring." Jessica's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. But I already told everyone they're all planning to come. Some of them are flying in from other states." "How exciting for you," Margaret replied pleasantly. "You'll get to show off your hostess skills." "I don't have hostess skills." Jessica's voice cracked with panic. "I don't know how to cook for 25 people. I don't even know how to cook for 5 people." Margaret's smile widened. "Then I suppose this will be a wonderful learning experience." The silence that followed was deafening. Jessica stared at Margaret as if she'd suddenly sprouted a second head. David looked back and forth between the two women like a spectator at a tennis match, clearly unsure whose side he was supposed to be on. Finally, Jessica found her voice. "You can't just leave. It's Christmas." "My Christmas," Margaret corrected gently. "And I've decided to spend it being pampered on a cruise ship instead of being taken for granted in my own kitchen." Jessica's eyes filled with tears, but Margaret felt no urge to comfort her. These weren't tears of hurt or disappointment. They were tears of panic from someone who'd just realized that their free labor was walking away. "But what about Emma?" Jessica tried desperately. "She's expecting Christmas here with Grandma." Margaret's expression softened slightly at the mention of her granddaughter. "Emma is welcome to come visit me when I get back. We'll have our own little celebration, just the two of us. She might enjoy having my undivided attention for once, instead of watching me run around like a chicken with its head cut off trying to serve your relatives." David finally found his voice. "Mom, this is extreme. Can't we talk about this?" "We're talking about it now," Margaret replied calmly. "I'm going upstairs to pack. My flight leaves tomorrow morning." "Tomorrow morning?" Jessica's voice went up an octave. "But Christmas is next week." "Yes, it is. You'll have plenty of time to figure things out." Margaret started toward the stairs, then paused and turned back. "Oh, and Jessica, when you're planning your menu, remember that my china only serves 12. You'll need to rent plates for the rest, and glasses, and silverware. The rental place on 5th Street is quite reasonable." With that, Margaret Wilson walked up the stairs to pack for the first vacation she'd taken in 15 years, leaving behind 2 adults who were just beginning to understand the magnitude of work that had been invisible to them for far too long. Behind her, she could hear Jessica's voice rising in panic. "David, what are we going to do? I don't even know how to make gravy." Margaret smiled as she pulled her suitcase from the closet. They were about to find out exactly what she'd been doing all these years, and she was about to find out what it felt like to be the guest instead of the help. Looking for more artifacts? Create new ones here. The Caribbean sun felt like a warm embrace. Margaret hadn't realized she'd been craving for years. Sitting on the deck of the Ocean Serenity, she watched dolphins dance in the ship's wake while sipping a perfectly prepared mimosa that someone else had made. For the first time in 15 years, Christmas morning had arrived without her alarm going off at 5 a.m. to start prepping a turkey. Her phone had been buzzing intermittently since she'd boarded 3 days ago, but Margaret had made a deliberate choice to ignore it. Whatever chaos was unfolding back home was no longer her emergency to solve. Instead, she'd spent her mornings at the ship's spa, her afternoons reading novels by the pool, and her evenings enjoying 5-course dinners prepared by actual professional chefs. The irony wasn't lost on her. Jessica had once suggested she could cater as a side business when she retired. Here she was, discovering what it felt like to be the customer instead of the caterer, and the difference was revelatory. "First cruise?" asked a woman settling into the deck chair beside her. Margaret turned to see an elegant lady about her own age, with silver hair pulled back in a sleek bun and laugh lines that spoke of a life well lived. "Is it that obvious?" Margaret laughed. "You have that slightly stunned look of someone who's just realized what relaxation feels like," the woman replied with a knowing smile. "I'm Helen, and I've been taking solo cruises for 8 years now. Best decision I ever made." "Margaret, and yes, I'm definitely discovering what I've been missing." Helen raised her own mimosa in a toast, to discovering ourselves outside of everyone else's expectations. As they clinked glasses, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years, genuine female friendship without the undercurrent of obligation or duty. Helen wasn't asking her to cook anything, clean anything, or solve anyone's problems. They were just two women enjoying each other's company. "So what finally drove you to escape?" Helen asked with the directness that seemed to come with age and experience. Margaret found herself telling Helen the whole story about Jessica's casual assumption that Margaret would host 25 people for Christmas, about 15 years of invisible labor, about the moment she'd finally said no and walked away. Helen listened without judgment, nodding in recognition. "Ah, the family servant syndrome. I know it well. Took me 68 years to realize that being indispensable was actually making me miserable." "Don't you ever feel guilty?" Margaret asked. "I keep thinking I should feel worse about leaving them to figure it out on their own." "Honey," Helen said, leaning forward conspiratorially, "guilt is just the feeling you get when you stop doing things that other people benefited from but never appreciated. The fact that you feel guilty means you're a good person. The fact that you left anyway means you're finally getting smart." Margaret's phone buzzed again, and this time she glanced at it. 17 missed calls from David, 12 from Jessica, and a string of increasingly frantic text messages. The most recent one from David read, "Mom, please call back. Jessica is having a breakdown and I don't know what to do." Margaret showed the message to Helen, who read it and chuckled. Classic. The moment the free labor disappears, suddenly it's an emergency that requires your immediate attention. "Part of me wants to call and help," Margaret admitted. "Of course you do. You've been conditioned to be their solution for 15 years. Helen studied Margaret's face carefully. "But what do you think will happen if you call now?" Margaret considered this. "Jessica will cry, David will guilt trip me, and I'll end up talking them through every detail of hosting Christmas dinner from a cruise ship phone. And then nothing will change. They'll manage to get through this Christmas with my remote assistance, and next year they'll just assume I'll be back to doing it all myself because I helped this time." Helen smiled. "You're smarter than you look." Margaret turned her phone face down on the small table between their chairs. "I need to let them figure this out." "You need to let them grow up," Helen corrected gently. "Your daughter-in-law is presumably a functioning adult who managed to navigate college and a career. She can figure out how to feed her own relatives." As if summoned by their conversation, Margaret's phone rang. David's name flashed on the screen. Against her better judgment, she answered. "David? Mom, thank God." "Where are you? We've been trying to reach you for days." "I'm exactly where I told you I'd be, on a cruise ship in the Caribbean." Margaret's voice was calm, but she could hear the chaos in the background of David's call. Multiple voices talking over each other, what sounded like something burning, and Jessica's voice rising above it all in what could only be described as controlled panic. "Mom, you have to come back. This is a disaster. Jessica doesn't know how to cook for this many people, and half her family is already here, and the kitchen it's like a war zone." Margaret looked out at the peaceful blue ocean and felt no urge whatsoever to rush back to rescue the situation. "I'm sure you'll figure it out." "We won't figure it out. Do you know how much food you need for 25 people? Do you know how long it takes to cook a turkey? Because we don't." "There are cookbooks, David. There's Google." There are grocery stores with delis that sell prepared food. People manage to feed large groups every day without my personal assistance. But it's not the same. David's voice cracked with frustration. It's not going to be like the Christmases you make. And there it was. The truth they'd never articulated but had always assumed, that Margaret's labor was both essential and effortless, valuable and invisible. "You're right," Margaret said quietly. "It won't be like the Christmases I make, because those Christmases required me to work for days so that everyone else could relax and enjoy themselves. This Christmas, everyone will have to contribute." Jessica's mom tried to help yesterday, but she and Jessica got into a fight about the menu. Half the relatives are staying in hotels now because we don't have enough bedrooms, and they're complaining about the extra expense. Jessica's been crying for 2 days straight. Margaret felt a familiar tug of sympathy, followed immediately by the recognition that this was exactly the emotional manipulation that had kept her trapped for years. "I'm sorry Jessica is stressed, but this was her event to plan. The consequences of poor planning are part of learning to plan better." "Mom, please, can you at least walk us through making the turkey?" Margaret looked at Helen, who was shaking her head with an expression that clearly said, "Don't you dare. David, I'm sitting by a pool being served lunch by professional waitstaff. I'm not going to spend my vacation giving cooking lessons over the phone. But we don't know what we're doing." "Then you'll learn. Or you'll order pizza. Either way, you'll survive, and I'll see you when I get back." "When are you coming back?" "January 3rd. The silence on the other end was deafening. Finally, David spoke, his voice small and hurt. "So you're really going to miss Christmas? Your first Christmas with Emma? Your first Christmas as a grandmother?" The guilt hit like a physical blow, and Margaret had to grip the armrest of her chair to keep from buckling. "Emma is welcome to have Christmas with me when I return. We can make cookies and watch Christmas movies and have our own celebration." "It's not the same." "No," Margaret agreed. "It's not. But it will be ours without me having to cook for 23 other people first." She ended the call and immediately felt the weight of her decision. Helen reached over and squeezed her hand. "That was the hardest part," Helen said softly. "The guilt calls. The attempts to make you responsible for fixing their poor planning." "What if I'm being selfish?" Margaret asked, voicing the fear that had been nagging at her since she'd boarded the ship. "Honey, you've been selfless for 15 years. You've earned the right to be a little selfish." Helen gestured toward the ocean. "Look around. You're not hurting anyone by being here. You're not depriving them of anything essential. You're just refusing to be their unpaid labor anymore." Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "I'm sorry. I never realized how much work you do. Please come home." It was the first apology Jessica had ever offered, and it felt both significant and insufficient. Margaret showed it to Helen. "Classic," Helen said. "The apology that comes only when they need something. If she'd realized how much work you do, she would have offered to help or hired caterers or suggested celebrating elsewhere. She only realizes it now because she has to do it herself." Margaret typed back, "I appreciate the apology. Enjoy your Christmas with your family." She didn't add, "I'll be there to help," or "We'll talk when I get back," or any of the reassuring phrases that would have allowed Jessica to hope for rescue. She simply acknowledged the apology and wished them well. Over the next few days, the messages continued. Photos of culinary disasters, panicked calls about logistics, David asking if she knew where the good serving platters were stored, Jessica wondering if Margaret had any easy recipes for 25 people. Margaret answered none of them. Instead, she attended a cooking class on the ship where a professional chef taught 12 passengers how to make a simple but elegant beef tenderloin. She learned that good food didn't require killing yourself in the kitchen. It required planning, technique, and reasonable expectations. She joined a book club discussion about women's memoirs and found herself in conversation with other women who had similar stories of invisible labor and delayed self-discovery. She danced at the ship's New Year's Eve party with a retired professor named Frank, who told her she had beautiful eyes and meant it as a compliment rather than a prelude to asking her to cook him dinner. For the first time in 15 years, Margaret experienced the holidays as leisure rather than labor. On New Year's Day, Helen found her on the deck again, this time reading a novel instead of answering text messages. "How are you feeling?" Helen asked, settling into her usual chair. "Guilty," Margaret admitted, "but also free. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense. Guilt is the price we pay for reclaiming ourselves, but freedom is the reward for paying it." Margaret's phone had been quiet for 2 days now, and she wasn't sure if that was a good sign or a bad one. Part of her worried that something terrible had happened. The larger part of her recognized that her family's crisis was not her emergency to solve. "What do you think happened?" Margaret asked. Helen smiled. "I think they figured it out. I think Jessica learned that hosting 25 people is actually work, not magic. I think David learned that his mother is a person with her own needs, not just a family resource, and I think they'll all survive." And if they didn't figure it out? Then they ordered pizza and made memories anyway. Sometimes the best family stories come from the disasters, not the perfect meals. Margaret laughed, imagining Jessica's perfectly curated Christmas dissolving into chaos and somehow becoming more real in the process. The ship docked in Miami on January 2nd, and Margaret felt a strange mix of reluctance and anticipation as she gathered her belongings. She'd grown fond of Helen and their daily conversations. She'd grown even fonder of the version of herself that existed on this ship. Relaxed, social, prioritizing her own needs without apology. "Are you ready to go back to reality?" Helen asked as they exchanged contact information. "I think I'm ready to create a new reality," Margaret replied. "One where I'm a participant in my family's life, not the unpaid staff." The flight home gave Margaret time to think about what she wanted her homecoming to look like. She wouldn't ask about Christmas. She wouldn't apologize for leaving. She wouldn't immediately volunteer to fix whatever ongoing problems might exist. She would simply return as Margaret Wilson, a woman who had rediscovered her own worth and was no longer willing to hide it behind endless service to others. The taxi pulled into her driveway at sunset on January 3rd. The house looked normal from the outside, though she noticed that Jessica's car wasn't in the driveway. David's was there, along with a small bicycle that hadn't been there when she left. Emma must be visiting. Margaret paid the taxi driver and wheeled her suitcase up the front walk, feeling like a stranger returning to her own life. She unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house was quiet, but she could hear voices coming from the kitchen. She followed the sound and found David and Emma sitting at the kitchen table, working on what appeared to be a jigsaw puzzle. "Grandma!" Emma shrieked, launching herself from her chair and running to throw her arms around Margaret's waist. Margaret hugged her granddaughter tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo and feeling the first pure joy she'd experienced since returning to land. "I missed you so much," Emma said, pulling back to look at Margaret's face. "Daddy said you went on a big boat." "I did, and I brought you something." Margaret reached into her carry-on bag and pulled out a small snow globe with a cruise ship inside. "I thought you might like to see what Grandma's vacation looked like." Emma shook the snow globe with delight while David watched from the table, his expression unreadable. "How was Christmas?" Margaret asked carefully. "Different," David replied. "Very different." He didn't elaborate, and Margaret didn't push. Emma continued to chatter about the snow globe while Margaret looked around her kitchen. It was clean, but there were subtle signs of recent chaos. A slight scorch mark on the counter near the stove, a new set of mismatched pot holders, and what looked like the remnants of takeout containers in the recycling bin. "Where's Jessica?" Margaret asked. "She went to stay with her parents for a few days," David said quietly. "She needed some time to process things." Margaret nodded. "And you? How are you processing things?" David was quiet for a long moment, then looked up at his mother with an expression she'd never seen before, something that looked like respect mixed with regret. "I'm realizing that I never really saw you before," he said quietly. "I saw Mom the cook, Mom the hostess, Mom the problem solver, but I never saw Margaret the person who might want something different for her holidays. Or see, it was more insight than Margaret had expected from her son, and it moved her more than she'd anticipated. What happened at Christmas?" she asked gently. David laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "We ordered Chinese food and played charades. Half of Jessica's family left early. The other half said it was the most relaxed Christmas they'd had in years because nobody was stressed about the meal." Margaret sat down at the table, absorbing this information. And how did Jessica take that? Not well, initially, but by the end of the week, I think she started to understand what she'd been asking of you all these years. David paused. We both did. Emma had moved on from the snow globe and was now climbing into Margaret's lap, settling in with the casual confidence of a beloved grandchild. Margaret held her close and looked at her son. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we figure out how to be a family where everyone contributes instead of just expecting you to handle everything." David's voice was steady, but Margaret could hear the uncertainty underneath. "If you'll let us try again." Margaret looked around her kitchen, not the family's kitchen, and felt something settle into place. She was home, but she was still herself. The woman who had discovered her own worth on a cruise ship hadn't disappeared the moment she walked through her front door. "I'd like that," she said, "but with some new rules." David nodded eagerly. "Whatever you want." "I want to be a grandmother and a mother-in-law, not a catering service. I want to be invited to family gatherings, not expected to provide them. And I want Christmas to be about family, not about proving that someone can produce a perfect meal." "Done," David said immediately. "And next Christmas, if Jessica wants to host 25 people, she's welcome to do it at her own house with her own planning and her own cooking." "Absolutely." Emma had fallen asleep in Margaret's lap, and Margaret stroked her granddaughter's hair while she considered the man her son had become in her absence. Not just because of Christmas, but because he'd been forced to see her as a person rather than a role. "I'm proud of you," she said finally, "for figuring it out on your own." "We almost didn't," David admitted, "but maybe that's what we needed, to fail without you there to catch us." Margaret looked around her quiet kitchen and felt the peace she'd discovered on the cruise ship settling into her bones. She was home, but she was home as herself, not as the invisible engine that made everyone else's life possible. For the first time in 15 years, that felt like enough.